Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A quiet morning, an unseen tension. The airport buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Travelers rushed past, dragging rolling suitcases behind them, coffee cups balanced precariously in their hands as they moved swiftly from one gate to another. The air was filled with the hum of announcements and the shuffle of footsteps, with airport staff in their crisp uniforms guiding the flow of people as if they were conductors orchestrating the daily symphony of departures and arrivals. Amelia Washington stood in the midst of this whirlwind, her hand securely gripping her daughter Sarah's, while her husband James navigated through the crowd with their son, Marcus, close by his side. The family of four had arrived early to the terminal, keen to ensure they had plenty of time before their flight to Atlanta. Today was special. It marked not just a routine family trip, but a carefully planned journey to a long-awaited family reunion. The excitement in the air was palpable, especially in the eyes of Marcus, who at 7 could hardly contain his joy as he chattered nonstop about meeting his cousins. Sarah, at 9, was more reserved, clutching her favorite book to her chest, her mind already imagining the endless hours she'd spend reading it on the plane. She wasn't as eager to talk about the trip as her brother, but her eyes shone with anticipation for what awaited them in Atlanta. The Washingtons had been saving for this trip for months, meticulously budgeting and planning every detail to make it a memorable experience. They had been through their share of struggles, but this was a moment of celebration, a rare opportunity to splurge and make lasting memories. First-class seats, something they had never experienced before, were a treat they had promised themselves. It was a splurge, yes, but one they believed would make the trip even more special. "Remember what we talked about," Amelia reminded her children as they approached the gate. "We're sitting in first class today, so we need to use our voices and be polite." "Yes, Mom," both children chorused obediently. Marcus, however, couldn't help but bounce slightly on his feet, his enthusiasm bubbling over. James exchanged a warm smile with his wife, a silent acknowledgement of their shared pride in this moment. They had worked hard for this trip, and seeing their kids excited about it made it all the more rewarding. "Don't forget, Sarah," Amelia added gently, "we'll be sitting in the special seats, so we need to remember to be extra careful with our manners. This is a treat, and we need to make sure we appreciate it." "I'll remember, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice soft but filled with determination. She was proud of her braids, the ones her grandmother had braided for her before their departure, and was looking forward to showing them off when they arrived. The boarding process began smoothly. The gate agent greeted the Washingtons with a friendly smile and scanned their tickets. As they walked down the jet bridge, the excitement continued to grow. Marcus practically bounced with every step, eager to find their seats and get the journey started. James helped Amelia carry their carry-ons, and Sarah clutched her book tightly, her excitement quiet but undeniable. The first-class cabin was like a dream come true. Soft lighting and spacious seats greeted them as they entered. The children's eyes widened in awe as they took in the plush surroundings. Amelia quickly settled Sarah into her seat while James stored their carry-ons in the overhead compartment. Marcus pressed his face against the window, watching the ground crew work below. "Look, Dad, they're putting the bags in," Marcus whispered loudly, pointing at the luggage cart with wide eyes. "Inside voice, buddy," James reminded him gently, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips as he watched his son's excitement. The thrill of it all was contagious, and even James felt a sense of nostalgia, remembering his first flight in first class years ago. It had been a business trip, something he hadn't expected to enjoy, but it had felt like entering a different world. Now, sharing this experience with his children, he was filled with a deep sense of pride. Meanwhile, several rows behind them, Margaret Carlton adjusted the delicate fabric of her designer scarf, her sharp eyes observing the Washington family as they settled in. First class was her sanctuary, a space she had reserved for years, treating it like a personal retreat from the chaos of the world. But seeing a black family board and settle in the section she considered reserved for a certain type of passenger was unsettling. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting from the family to the other passengers, trying to find someone who shared her discomfort. But no one seemed bothered. the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight beverages, and passengers were absorbed in their own pre-flight routines. One businessman was typing furiously on his laptop, while an elderly couple flipped through magazines. But Margaret's focus was entirely on the Washingtons, and the more she watched, the more agitated she became. Lisa, the flight attendant, smiled as she approached the Washington family, her voice warm and friendly. "What can I get for you folks today?" she asked. "Apple juice," Marcus said, barely remembering to lower his voice. "I'll have water, thank you," James ordered. "Ginger ale, please," Amelia added, before Sarah politely asked for apple juice, just like her brother. Lisa moved swiftly, bringing their drinks in elegant glassware, which made Margaret's irritation grow. The children's manners were impeccable, and the family was composed and calm, making Margaret feel all the more out of place. The Washingtons were doing everything right, they were quiet, polite, and careful with their belongings. But it wasn't the family's behavior that bothered Margaret, it was their presence in a space she felt belonged to a different class of people. The flight continued to board, and more passengers filed in. The young executive across from Margaret nodded politely as he took his seat, immediately donning his noise-canceling headphones, his attention fully absorbed in whatever podcast he was listening to. Margaret's frustration grew as she noticed how other passengers seemed to smile at the Washington family, offering them kind glances. It was a small detail, but it irritated her. She didn't understand why they weren't as uncomfortable as she was. "Are we going to see Grandma soon?" Marcus asked, his voice low as he adjusted his seatbelt with his father's help. "About 2 hours," Amelia replied, smiling at her son as she helped him get comfortable. 2 hours to relax, 2 hours of smooth sailing before they reached Atlanta and could finally relax with family. It was a precious time, one that had been years in the making. Margaret couldn't shake her irritation. The family before her, so perfectly composed, was everything she had not expected in first class. Each movement they made, from settling in with ease to their polite conversations, was like a challenge to her idea of who belonged in this space. And yet, they were doing nothing wrong. They weren't loud. They weren't causing any trouble. In fact, they were handling themselves better than many of the seasoned first-class travelers she had encountered over the years. And that was what made it worse. The Washingtons were making no mistakes, and that was the problem. As the cabin door began to close, Margaret's discomfort reached its peak. She felt the need to do something, to voice her displeasure, but the family continued to defy her expectations, leaving her speechless. Would she act, or would she stay silent? The tension in the air was thick, and the flight was about to take off, but for Margaret, it seemed the real journey had only just begun. The unexpected confrontation. The hum of the plane's engines began to fill the cabin as the last few passengers found their seats. The overhead bins clicked shut, and the flight attendants made their final checks. Amelia helped Marcus get his seatbelt fastened, while Sarah adjusted her headphones, ready for the long journey ahead. James sat back in his seat with a contented sigh, watching his family settle into the comfort of first class. The flight was about to take off, and for the Washingtons, this was the culmination of weeks of careful planning and anticipation. The excitement was palpable, especially for Marcus, who had spent most of the past few weeks talking about seeing his cousins again. He could hardly contain his joy, and Amelia couldn't help but smile at his excitement. As the plane taxied down the runway, the cabin grew quiet, save for the soft murmurs of passengers settling in and the occasional click of a seatbelt being fastened. Amelia glanced out of the window, watching as the ground seemed to fall away beneath them. She squeezed James's hand, a silent acknowledgement of the hard work and sacrifices they had made to make this moment possible. But Margaret Carleton, sitting a few rows behind them, was far from relaxed. As the plane ascended into the sky, her mind raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The Washington family, with their well-mannered children and their quiet dignity, had somehow intruded upon a space she had always believed to be reserved for people like her. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what bothered her, but the discomfort in her chest only grew stronger as the plane soared higher. She stole a glance at the family once more. The children were engrossed in their tablets, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the screens, while Amelia was reading her book, looking perfectly at ease in her seat. James, too, appeared completely comfortable, his eyes closed as he leaned back, likely preparing for the long flight ahead. Margaret's fingers drummed nervously against the armrest. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but the unease wouldn't go away. She had been flying first class for years, and in all that time, she had never encountered a family like the Washingtons. She had always associated first class with business people, executives, or people of a certain caliber, people who fit into the polished, orderly world of premium air travel. The Washingtons, with their down-to-earth demeanor and the lively energy of their children, felt out of place. That's when it happened. Without any warning, Margaret leaned forward, her voice loud enough to catch the attention of those around her. "Excuse me," she said, addressing the flight attendant who had just passed by. "I'd like to make a complaint." Lisa, the flight attendant, turned toward her with a polite smile. She had dealt with complaints before, but there was something about Margaret's tone that made her pause for a moment. It wasn't just a typical request for a drink or a change of seat, it was something more. Something sharper. "Of course, ma'am," Lisa said, maintaining her professionalism. "What seems to be the problem?" Margaret's eyes flickered toward the Washingtons, her gaze narrowing as she gestured toward them. "That family over there," she said, her voice low but insistent. They're disturbing the atmosphere of this cabin." Lisa's brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't understand." "They're not being loud or disruptive. They're just getting settled in, like everyone else." Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "That's exactly it. They don't belong here. This is first class, not some place for families like that. It's uncomfortable to watch. I can't even enjoy my flight with them sitting there." The flight attendant's expression shifted slightly, though she still maintained her professionalism. She glanced toward the Washington family, who were quietly engrossed in their activities, unaware of the tension building behind them. "Ma'am, I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. They've been nothing but polite. I haven't noticed any issues." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "I'm telling you, it's wrong. I've been flying first class for years, and I've never seen a family like that here. It's just inappropriate." There was a brief silence as Lisa assessed the situation. She had been a flight attendant for many years, and she was no stranger to difficult passengers. But this was different. The tone in Margaret's voice was unmistakable, and she couldn't ignore the undertones of prejudice that lingered in her words. Lisa had dealt with passengers who felt entitled, who expected special treatment, but this felt more insidious. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Lisa said softly, her voice firm but kind. "I understand that you may feel uncomfortable, but I assure you, there's no reason for that. The Washington family is here because they bought tickets, just like everyone else. They are our valued passengers, and we expect all of our guests to treat each other with respect." Margaret's face flushed with indignation. "I'm not being disrespectful. I'm just saying it's not right. They don't belong in this section of the plane. I've paid for this seat. I've earned this spot, and I don't want to be made uncomfortable because of them." Lisa could feel the tension rising, but she didn't back down. "I understand you're upset, ma'am, but I assure you, there is no issue here. I'm going to check on the rest of the passengers, but I expect you to treat everyone on this flight with the respect they deserve." With that, Lisa walked away, leaving Margaret seething in her seat. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glared at the Washingtons, her eyes lingering on the family that, in her mind, had disrupted the sanctity of first class. She had hoped that her complaint would be taken seriously, that someone would agree with her. But instead, she felt dismissed. The flight attendant had been polite, even empathetic, but there was no mistaking the fact that Lisa had defended the family's presence in first class. Margaret clenched her fists in frustration, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to process what had just happened. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of injustice, as though her world had been turned upside down. The Washingtons were calm, composed, and well-mannered, everything Margaret had always associated with upper-class passengers, but somehow, their very presence in this space felt like a challenge. It was as if they were mocking her, proving that she didn't belong in the world she had carefully built for herself. As the flight continued, Margaret's discomfort only deepened. She tried to distract herself with her magazine, but the pages blurred in front of her eyes. Every time she looked up, the Washington family was there, laughing quietly, reading, chatting softly among themselves. They were just another family on a plane, and yet, to Margaret, they were something more, an embodiment of everything she resented about the world she felt slipping from her grasp. The hours stretched on, but Margaret's mind remained fixated on the Washingtons. She couldn't let go of the feeling that she needed to do something, that somehow, she had to make her discomfort known. The flight was far from over, and the tension in her chest only grew with every passing minute. And then, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, shattering the quiet hum of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," he began, his tone calm but authoritative. "We've just reached cruising altitude, and I want to take a moment to thank you all for flying with us today. We are here to ensure that everyone has a comfortable and safe flight. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We are here to help." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment everything seemed to pause. Margaret, her teeth clenched, waited for the captain to continue, expecting the usual pleasantries. But what came next was nothing like she expected. "However, there is one thing that I must address," the captain's voice continued, now carrying a weight of authority that made every passenger sit up a little straighter. "This plane is a place where we treat each other with respect, regardless of who we are, where we come from, or what we look like. We do not tolerate any form of discrimination. We are all here to share this space, and I ask that you respect one another." Margaret's heart stopped for a moment, her face turning pale. The message was unmistakable. It was directed at her. And the realization hit her like a freight train. The captain's words, calm yet resolute, left her speechless. She had hoped for support, for validation of her discomfort, but instead, she was being reminded of the very values she had tried to ignore. She was being called out, not just as a passenger, but as someone who had allowed her biases to shape her experience. Margaret sank back in her seat, her face burning with humiliation. The flight attendant's words, the captain's announcement, it was all a reminder that the world she had tried to create for herself was no longer one she could control. The Washingtons, with their quiet dignity, had not only taken their rightful place in first class, they had forced Margaret to confront the uncomfortable truth that the space she had once claimed for herself was no longer a place of comfort, but one of painful self-reflection. "You said." A flight that changed everything. As the captain's announcement echoed in Margaret's mind, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The words reverberated through the plane, hanging in the air like an undeniable truth. Margaret sat frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the armrest, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on being in control of her surroundings, on carefully curating the life she had built. Yet, in this moment, she felt as though that control was slipping away from her, like sand through her fingers. The rest of the passengers remained eerily quiet, perhaps unsure of what to make of the captain's words. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the soft hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of pages as someone turned a magazine or flicked through their phone. Margaret's eyes darted around the cabin, desperate for some sign of support, something to validate her feelings. But all she saw were the same faces she had noticed before, the young businessman with his headphones on, the elderly couple flipping through a magazine, and the Washingtons, who were still quietly engrossed in their own little world. Amelia, seated in the window row with her daughter Sarah beside her, glanced up, noticing the tension in the air. She had been blissfully unaware of the exchange between Margaret and the flight attendant, but now, she sensed something had changed. It wasn't the usual calm of the flight she had anticipated. Her instincts told her that something was amiss. James, noticing the subtle shift in atmosphere, turned to Amelia with a raised eyebrow. "Is everything okay?" he asked in a low voice, his gaze flicking toward the front of the cabin. Amelia smiled reassuringly, though her thoughts were elsewhere. I think it's just the tension of a long flight. We're almost halfway there. She turned back to Sarah, adjusting her daughter's headphones, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy despite the unease that was beginning to settle in the cabin. She had hoped this trip would be nothing but joy, a celebration of family, of overcoming challenges, of finally making it to a place where they could simply relax and enjoy each other's company. But now, it felt as though an invisible weight had settled over them. Margaret, meanwhile, was seething in her seat. The captain's words had hit her harder than she could have anticipated. She had never considered herself to be a person who discriminated, at least not consciously. She had always believed in the importance of hard work, of earning her place in the world. She had worked tirelessly to build her life, her career, her status, and she had done so with the firm belief that the world operated on a system of merit. People like her had earned their way into the spaces they inhabited. And yet, now, as the captain's announcement echoed in her ears, she was forced to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth. It wasn't just about earning your place. It was about respect. It was about recognizing that no one's presence was any less valid than hers, regardless of their background or appearance. The Washington family's mere existence in first class had exposed something within Margaret, a prejudice she had never fully acknowledged. It wasn't just about the Washingtons. It was about a deeper, more ingrained belief she had carried for years without truly questioning it. Her thoughts spiraled, and she felt a growing sense of shame that she couldn't shake off. She was being forced to reckon with the fact that her discomfort with the Washingtons wasn't about their behavior. It wasn't about their children being too loud or unruly, as she had initially convinced herself. It was about their mere presence, about the fact that they, too, belonged in this space. She had judged them because of who they were, not because of how they acted. As the flight continued, Margaret struggled with the gnawing feeling of guilt that clung to her. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried to focus on the scenery outside the window or the magazine in her lap. She knew, deep down, that she had been wrong. But admitting that to herself, and worse, to anyone else, was a monumental task. Meanwhile, Amelia and James remained blissfully unaware of the internal turmoil unfolding behind them. They were just happy to be together, to finally be on a flight that would take them to a family reunion they had been looking forward to for months. They hadn't let the discomfort of the earlier interaction with the gate agent or the mild tension with some of the other passengers sour their excitement. Their children were content, each lost in their own world of books and movies. The Washingtons, in their eyes, were simply a family enjoying a well-deserved break. Amelia looked over at James with a warm smile, her heart swelling with pride as she watched him interact with the children. Marcus was already absorbed in his tablet, his small fingers flying across the screen as he picked out a movie, while Sarah sat with her book, her brow furrowed in concentration. Amelia could see that they were growing up fast, and she cherished these moments when the family was together, when they were safe and happy. It wasn't until they were halfway through the flight that things began to shift. The plane had been cruising for nearly 3 hours when the announcement came over the intercom again, this time from a different voice, the flight attendant, Lisa, whom Margaret had spoken to earlier. She made her way down the aisle, her eyes scanning the passengers with a practiced gaze. She was known for being calm and collected in the face of difficult situations, and Margaret had already pegged her as a force to be reckoned with. Lisa moved gracefully through the cabin, checking in with passengers and offering assistance where needed. As she passed by the Washingtons' row, she stopped for a moment. Lisa had noticed the subtle change in the atmosphere as well. She could tell that something wasn't quite right, and her professional instincts kicked in. "Is everything okay, folks?" she asked, her tone warm but observant. Amelia looked up from her book, flashing a smile. "Yes, everything's fine. The kids are doing well, and we're all settled in. Thank you for checking in." Lisa nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to let me know." As she continued down the aisle, Lisa's eyes briefly met Margaret's. The woman was sitting rigidly in her seat, her posture stiff and uncomfortable. Margaret looked away quickly, her gaze shifting toward the window, but the brief encounter didn't go unnoticed. Lisa had a sharp eye for tension, and she could tell that something was brewing under the surface. She had dealt with passengers like Margaret before, the ones who felt entitled, who believed that their money bought them privilege. But she had also learned not to let those feelings fester. Everyone on this plane deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their background, and she wouldn't tolerate anyone undermining that. Margaret's frustration continued to simmer, but this time, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. She looked at the Washingtons again, her gaze lingering on the children, who were so absorbed in their tablets that they hadn't even noticed the tension around them. They were just children, curious, innocent, and unaware of the storm that had been brewing around them. Margaret could see the warmth between the parents and their children, the quiet affection they shared. And, for the first time, she realized that they were no different from her own family. In that moment, something clicked within her. She had spent so long thinking that the world was divided into categories, those who belonged and those who didn't. She had spent so many years building walls around her life, keeping certain people out. But the Washingtons, with their quiet grace, had forced her to see the world differently. They weren't an intrusion into her world, they were a part of it. Just like her. Margaret exhaled slowly, the tension in her body beginning to dissipate. She realized that she had been wrong, completely wrong. The uncomfortable feelings she had been experiencing weren't about the Washingtons or their children. They were about her own biases, her own insecurities. It was about her own fear of losing control, of seeing the world change in ways she couldn't understand. She sat back in her seat, her mind still processing the realization that had begun to dawn on her. The flight was far from over, but Margaret knew that this journey, both literal and emotional, would change her forever. The heart of change. The remainder of the flight seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The plane cruised through the sky as the Washington family settled deeper into their routines, their presence in first class no longer causing any stir. Margaret, however, sat quietly in her seat, her thoughts consumed with what had transpired in the past few hours. She couldn't seem to escape the internal shift that had occurred, the dissonance between the life she had built and the uncomfortable realization that had dawned on her. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Margaret's gaze drifted out the window, but it wasn't the view that caught her attention, it was the reflection in the glass. There, staring back at her, was a woman she barely recognized. She had spent so long creating a version of herself that she thought she could be proud of, a version that thrived on exclusivity and control, but now, for the first time, she saw the flaws beneath the surface. She had constructed her identity around certain beliefs, about privilege, about hard work, about who belonged and who didn't. But those beliefs had been tested, and for the first time, she wasn't sure they stood up to scrutiny. Her thoughts were interrupted as the plane began its final approach, and the passengers around her began to stir. The Washingtons, too, were preparing for landing. Amelia and James busied themselves with securing the children, offering gentle reminders to sit upright and buckle their seatbelts. There was an air of tranquility about the family, an assurance that no matter what, they would be together, and they would make it through. Margaret couldn't help but notice how differently she was now viewing their interactions. What she had once dismissed as ordinary had taken on a new depth. The Washingtons were simply a family, just like hers, trying to make their way in the world, trying to create something meaningful. Margaret's internal dialogue shifted once more. Instead of focusing on what had made her uncomfortable, she began to focus on the beauty of the family dynamic in front of her. Amelia's smile as she adjusted Sarah's hair, James's patient voice as he reassured Marcus about the landing, the simple joy of a family making a journey together. Margaret thought about the way they had navigated this flight, how they had respected the space, interacted with the flight attendants, and cared for their children. It was a portrait of grace and dignity, and it made her reflect on her own life, on the things she had taken for granted, the privileges she had assumed were her birthright. As the plane touched down and began taxiing to the gate, Margaret's mind was still racing. She had always prided herself on her ability to compartmentalize emotions, to keep her personal beliefs and biases neatly tucked away. But now, she realized, she could no longer ignore the truth that had been exposed during this flight. She had spent years living in a bubble, surrounded by people who looked like her, thought like her, and shared the same values. But that bubble had been burst, and the world outside was so much more complex, more beautiful, and more diverse than she had ever imagined. The plane came to a halt, and the seatbelt signs flickered off. Passengers began to unbuckle, eager to disembark. Margaret stayed seated, taking a deep breath as she watched the Washington family gather their belongings. They were still the same, still that picture of familial love and quiet strength. They hadn't changed, but she had. Her view of the world had been irrevocably altered. When the cabin door opened, and the passengers began to filter out, Margaret made a decision. She was going to approach the Washingtons. She had no clear idea of what she was going to say, only that she needed to do something, something that would acknowledge the change she had undergone. She needed to make amends, to somehow show them that she understood now. As they were preparing to exit the plane, Margaret stood up from her seat. Her heart pounded in her chest, the uncertainty of the moment making her nerves fray. She spotted Amelia and James at the front of the plane, gathering Marcus and Sarah, ready to exit. Taking a deep breath, Margaret made her way toward them. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tentative but firm. Amelia looked up, surprised at the woman's sudden approach. "Yes?" Amelia replied, offering a polite smile. "I just wanted to. I wanted to say thank you," Margaret began, struggling to find the right words. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "Thank you for being here. For being yourselves. For showing me what true grace and dignity look like." Amelia's smile softened, and she glanced at James, who was standing beside her. "I'm sorry if we made you feel uncomfortable," Amelia said, her voice calm but with a hint of concern. "That was never our intention." Margaret shook her head quickly, her eyes welling up with emotion. "No, it's not you. It was me. I've spent so much of my life building walls around myself, around my beliefs. I've judged people based on appearances, on what I thought they deserved. But today, you showed me how wrong I've been. How much I've been missing." James, who had been listening intently, placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We all have moments of growth, ma'am," he said gently. "None of us are perfect. But recognizing when we've been wrong is the first step toward changing." Margaret nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had spent so much time avoiding discomfort, avoiding the hard truths. But now, she was embracing it. She could feel her old beliefs slowly dissolving, replaced by something new, something more expansive, more compassionate. The family exchanged a few more words, and then, with a final glance, they turned and walked down the jet bridge toward the terminal. Margaret watched them go, a sense of peace settling over her. She knew that this encounter, this journey, had marked a turning point in her life. She wasn't the same person who had boarded the flight in Washington. She had been changed, reshaped by the Washington family's quiet example of resilience, by the captain's bold announcement, and by her own willingness to confront her biases. As Margaret made her way off the plane and into the terminal, she felt lighter. The weight of the world she had built around her had been lifted, replaced by something more beautiful, an understanding that everyone, no matter their background, deserves respect, dignity, and the opportunity to thrive. And as she walked through the bustling airport, she knew that she would carry this lesson with her for the rest of her life. In that moment, Margaret understood, change isn't always easy, but it's always possible. And sometimes, it takes a single flight, a single moment, to alter the course of your life forever.